So, well, I'll just go to the first slide because it includes this. This is not the kind of talk that I'm used to giving. Normally, when I speak to groups, I'm presenting research findings from some project that was carried out, or presenting an idea for a research project. And usually there are a lot of references, and I'm citing a lot of data, and that's not really going to be the case for this particular talk. When they asked me to give a talk on why motivational interviewing is particularly well suited for use in Native populations, I thought, well, isn't it obvious? but apparently, maybe not so much so. And when I actually started thinking about it, I was like, well, I wonder if I can find anything on that. And I found one YouTube video of a Native guy saying, well, it just kind of makes perfect sense because it's really rude to tell someone what to do. And so, motivational interviewing is just a great approach. And while I agreed with that statement, I thought that there was just a little bit more to it than that. And so, I spent a little bit of time sort of contemplating it. And so what I came up with is what the rest of this talk is about. And these are just my opinions. Like I said, it's not really evidence-based. There aren't going to be a whole lot of references. There's a little bit of evidence at the end, but for the most part, it's just my understanding as it is now. I'm going to start off by saying that as most of you, I'm sure, know, most tribal languages, the word for their own people just means human beings. And so a lot of what I'm going to say is really going to apply to all human beings. It's not going to be specific to natives necessarily. I think that regardless of what color your skin is, a lot of these things are going to resonate with people just because we're all humans. It may be more salient for natives, but maybe not. So I came up with what I thought were 6 sort of values that were inherent in native culture that were also really compatible with what they refer to as the spirit of MI. And in these slides I use the term the MI attitude a lot, just because I think of spirit as being something different, but I can totally go along with their use of the term spirit and the spirit of MI. And so I'm going to just go through each one of these and talk a little bit about sort of my understanding of it and how it relates to the approach and the attitude that one assumes when you're doing MI, and sort of how it, Chris talked a little bit about how doing MI changes you, and I think that maybe some of these will speak to some of that. So the first one that I thought of was self-determination. One of the primary things about all sort of tribal agreements with the federal government was sovereignty. They had to be sovereign nations. And I think that is not just a political thing. I think that that's because it's very important culturally for us. We have this belief in self-determination, this belief that you cannot, in good conscience, direct another person's actions. And it's very, very rude to tell another person what to do, unless, of course, you're their grandmother, in which case all bets are off and she can tell you anything. But people are expected to do what's best for them. Given the situation that they're in, we sort of trust that they will make choices that are good choices for them, and that's sort of just the rule. I made this little note to myself down here about Spiro, Daedra, and the window. Spiro Manson and Daedra Buchwald are 2 of my main sort of mentors throughout my research career. And Spiro is a Sioux gentleman, and Daedra is very German. And they are currently married and somewhat happy. But Spiro likes to tell this story about when they were first dating and starting to get together. He went over to Daedra's house, and they were sitting on the couch, and the bay doors were open in the main room. And he made a couple of comments like, the nights are getting cooler here in Seattle, a little breezy. And they kept talking, and he was like, there had been some concerns about, the crime activity in this neighborhood, in the recent past. And he kept talking a little bit more, and he kept dropping these hints, and eventually Daedra said, "Are you trying to get at something?" And he was like, "Well, the door's wide open, and it's getting pretty late." And she was like, "Do you want me to close the door or the window?" And he was like, "Yes." She was like, "Why didn't you just say that?" Because you don't do that. Another is responsibility. And I think that that this is another sort of core cultural value that we have. And many of our relatives have talked about at great length in various speeches that have been written down by others and codified. But it flows directly from the importance of self-determination. If you're going to have that freedom to self-determine and to make your own choices, then you have to take responsibility for those choices. Your actions and behaviors have consequences, and you have to live with them, and it's just part of the deal. It's just part of the package. And it's no one's responsibility to change our actions, our choices, our behaviors, except for our own. And I think that MI inherently recognizes that. Motivational interviewing puts the responsibility for change with the individual who's making the change, and tries to allow that just to be there, and to respect their self-determination. And I think that that's something that's really compatible with Native culture. Respect. The basic consideration of others as equals. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, Native culture extends beyond just humans, but at least for other humans. You know, any conscious, feeling, living being is equal to each other. And MI takes this position that when you're working with a patient or a client, you're maybe guiding them, like Chris pointed out, but more often you're sitting beside them. And you're sort of walking down the road together. And you're having a conversation about what's on the road. And I think that basic respect of treating the other as an equal with their own agency is really key to MI. And as equals, we expect people to act when action is needed. And I think that MI helps them to sort of see maybe a little more clearly when action might be needed. He mentioned empathy a few times too, and this is something that I just kind of took for granted, and I never really thought about it very much until I was maybe in college. I thought everybody experienced everybody else's emotions, but apparently that wasn't the case. But it's basically just the ability to take the perspective of another and feel what they feel, and to have their experience in a very similar way to what they experience. And the attitude of MI, or the spirit of MI, is one of identifying with the other person. This is one of the ways that you create that penalty-free zone that Chris was talking about. When you take their perspective and you see the world from their point of view, their actions seem completely reasonable, and no judgment is really necessary or appropriate. I mean, it just requires the understanding that everyone, no matter who they are, what they're doing the best that they can with what they've got available to them at that point in time. And that's just the key understanding for empathy, is that no matter from the outside how dysfunctional a behavior may seem, it's serving a function for that person from their perspective with what they have available. And what they have available can be resources, it can be knowledge, it can be perspective, it can be any number of things, but from where they stand, what they're doing makes sense. And to understand how it makes sense and see that, I think that's empathy. Another central Native value is the sense of pride. I had to / dignity this one because I couldn't figure out what the exact word was, and I don't think that either one of those words actually captures it. It's not really pride as in a sense of being proud of something, but dignity is a little too low-key, because dignity is just the basic recognition of worth in another. But I think if you find a middle ground between those two of being, raising oneself above versus just simply recognizing that there's worth there, you get somewhere in the middle there, and you get like self-sufficiency, strength. And the spirit of MI leaves the client's pride intact. Actually, you bolstered a bit. I mean, as you pointed out several times, that you're trying to empower the other person, right? And we are eliciting change talk in people when we're getting them to to sort of talk about how they may want to approach change. We're actually playing on their pride a little bit. You're really kind of getting into their sense of worth, and that is going to be the ground that they're going to stand on. It's going to give them the confidence to make whatever changes that you're talking about, or that they're talking about accurately. And that inherent sort of ground to stand on is usually stilted up by the connection that their sense of worth has to the values that they hold dear. The guy in the video with his grandchildren, right? That's something he held dear. Family was a value that was going to prop up his confidence to make a change because it was providing motivation. And the sense of connection, and in retrospect I should have called this one probably harmony instead of connection, but I think connection still works. The understanding that nothing is separate from anything else, and that anything that happens in one piece of the puzzle, or the world, or the family, or the system, or the community, or whichever object you're talking about, is going to affect everything else around it. And I think that because MI is about connecting with the client, or the patient, and being with them where they are, and recognizing that your interactions are affecting each other back and forth, and you're trying to empathize with them, you're trying to take their perspective, that this really decreases the isolation that they feel. And it can create that penalty-free zone where change is not as scary, it's not as frightening. They're not alone. So all of these are related to the MI approach, and in my view, really just constituent parts of it, in the spirit of MI. But also, MI, in case you haven't got to this part of the book yet, actually, I don't even know if it's in that edition, but it has a not-so-secret value. And that is Therapeutic Alliance. And this was the thing actually that stuck out to me the most in the video, was this development of therapeutic working alliance that happened between the counselor and the rounder, right? So he came in hostile toward her, and that's indicative of a pretty low alliance. But within the course of, what was it, 20 minutes? They were working together. They had a shared perspective on the problem. He had, come around to producing nice little bits of change talk. He was considering making positive change. And that's really what Therapeutic Alliance is about. Development of a personal bond composed of reciprocal positive feelings, agreement on the goals of treatment, and agreement on the tasks to meet those goals. Now this is the part where I'm going to talk about a little bit of evidence. Because Therapeutic Alliance is the single best predictor of behavior change as a result of a therapeutic endeavor. No matter whether you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, interpersonal therapy, transpersonal therapy, analytic therapy, doesn't matter what school of thought you come from. The most variance in the amount of change that clients make as a result of a therapeutic relationship has to do with the degree of therapeutic working alliance that they have with their counselor. The MI approach, based on the values I presented earlier, assumes that the client has dignity and inherent worth, empathically connects with the client, respects the self-determination of the client, and recognizes the client's responsibility for their self. Thereby they create an environment in that interaction that fosters the positive reciprocal bond. And because it assumes that everyone is doing the very best that they can with what they have available, the condition for empathy, assumes that the client has dignity and inherent worth, respects their self-determination, it fosters agreement on goals of treatment because they're allowing the patient to define those goals. You don't necessarily have to think that they made the very best choice, right? I mean, it's their life. They're the ones who get to set the goals. But at least they're making a choice that is in a direction that's away from the status quo, that is interrupting the problematic behaviors that have brought them into your office. And so because of the respect for responsibility and, again, self-determination, while reflecting back client values and choices, it fosters agreement on the tasks of change. So the person produces change thought, and you begin to, which we'll, I think, get to this afternoon, you begin to sort of help them in the process of planning how this change might take place. What might be the first couple of steps? And they produce those. And you just help them to sort of form them up and encourage them to keep producing them. But they all come from the patient, or the client, or whichever term you prefer. So the methods of MI are almost exactly what are needed in order to produce a good therapeutic alliance. So the research on how therapeutic alliance actually fosters change are that it decreases discomfort, increases positive emotion, and increases confidence in the change process. Those are the three things that sort of seem to form the legs of the stool that facilitates change. If you can do those things, you remove barriers that the person may perceive, and therefore allow them and empower them to make changes. So back to the original question, why motivational interviewing for urban Indian health organizations? Given that all of these values that are sort of inherent in native culture, regardless of what tribe you're from, pretty much, and because in urban Indian health organizations you see people from all tribes, pretty much, you don't usually see people from just one. I mean, people come to cities from all over the place. It's one of the things that's really great about the population, right? It's the diversity. But these common threads, I think, run through all of them, and they feed into each other. And they're all inherent in the spirit of MI. They're all fundamental to the approach that you bring with you when you're doing MI with a patient or client. They form the very basis of the attitude that you enter the interaction with. And that's why I think that it's a really great fit. And that's actually all I have. Questions, comments?
That was good. It was a very good. We kind of brought it together.
Okay.
A lot.
Okay.